Welcome to another deep dive, and today we're taking a look at a pretty hot topic: President Trump's proposal to relocate residents of the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
It's been in the news a lot. It's caused a lot of debate. People are concerned, and we've got some really great sources to break down today.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at expert commentary and really try to understand the potential geopolitical implications of this. I gotta say, pretty controversial idea.
It is a bold idea, to say the least, and one that I think deserves very, very careful consideration. I think what's particularly interesting about this, though, is that while, a lot of people, and rightfully so, will dismiss this as sort of just classic Trumpian provocation.
Right.
His past actions, I think, suggest we can't afford to write it off completely.
That's right. Think about when he first mentioned moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem or recognizing the Golan Heights as Israeli territory.
Right.
Initially, a lot of experts really scoffed at that and said, no, that's never going to happen. He's just saying that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet both of those actions ended up having major geopolitical repercussions.
Right, exactly. I mean, the embassy move, for instance, that really alienated key Palestinian negotiators, and it was seen by many in the international community as really undermining the peace process. The Golan Heights decision as well, while welcomed by Israel, it further inflamed tensions with Syria, and it raised a lot of concerns about potential violations of international law.
Right.
So I think when Trump kind of throws out an idea like relocating the Gaza Strip, it's worth examining not just what might the potential outcomes be, but, what is the historical context here? What are his motivations?
Okay, so let's unpack some of those motivations then. You've got access to a lot more information than I do, so I'm really relying on you here. I mean, is this, do you think, a genuine attempt at peacemaking? Is it a strategic move to bolster Netanyahu's political standing? Or is it more about kind of appealing to specific groups within the U.S.?
Yeah. I mean, it's probably a pretty complicated interplay of all those factors, to be honest. On the one hand, Trump has always framed his approach to this Israeli-Palestinian conflict as this kind of like deal-making approach, right?
Yeah.
So this proposal could be seen as a way to shake up the status quo and kind of force both sides to consider these sort of out-of-the-box solutions.
Right. So it's kind of like a think outside the box approach to a problem that's been lingering for a very long time.
Precisely. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
But, at the same time, I think we can't ignore those domestic political considerations.
Right.
This proposal clearly resonates with certain segments of Trump's base, particularly those who kind of staunchly support Israel's right to security and territorial expansion.
You mentioned specific groups within the U.S. that this really resonates with.
Mm-hmm.
Could you maybe elaborate a bit on who those groups are?
Yeah, certainly. So, we're talking about groups like evangelical Christians, who really see Israel's claim to the land as biblically ordained, and then also, these pro-Israel lobbying groups that exert a ton of influence on U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
And, for these groups, a proposal like relocating the Gaza Strip, it really aligns with their belief that Israel should have undisputed control over the territory that it claims.
Okay, so it's not just about geopolitics in the Middle East.
No.
It's also about internal U.S. politics and ideology?
Absolutely. And understanding those dynamics, I think, it's really crucial to being able to decipher Trump's intentions and predict how far he might actually be willing to push this.
Right. Okay, so we've got kind of Trump's motivations, but what about the international response to this? Our sources suggest that, Egypt and Jordan are not really thrilled with this proposal.
Right.
At all.
No, I mean, their opposition is really significant, and for good reason.
Yeah.
Egypt, which obviously shares a border with Gaza, they've been a key mediator between Israel and Hamas, which is, the Palestinian faction that governs the Strip. Jordan, with its large Palestinian population, has historically played this very kind of stabilizing role in the region, and they're deeply concerned about the potential for this kind of unrest and displacement.
So, I mean, if this were to happen, what do you think would be the most immediate consequence of such a relocation? What would be the first domino to fall?
Well, I think the most likely scenario is this huge surge in violence and unrest.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, imagine, the anger and the despair of millions of Palestinians being forced from their homes, right? I mean, imagine the logistical nightmare of such a massive population transfer. Imagine the strain that it puts on the countries that they're being relocated to. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a recipe for chaos.
And our sources indicate that even U.S. media outlets, even some that are traditionally, quite supportive of Israel,
Right.
have expressed really serious reservations about this plan.
That's right. Outlets like CNN, for example, they've argued that this plan would violate decades of U.S. foreign policy, which has consistently sought this two-state solution based on, direct negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians.
So this could really alienate key U.S. allies and damage America's reputation on the global stage.
Yeah, I mean, precisely. And that's definitely something the Trump administration, I think, would have to weigh very carefully as they consider the potential cost and benefits of this plan.
So we've talked about potential pushback from, key players in the region and even within the U.S., but what about the Arab world more broadly? I mean, they've historically been very, very vocal supporters of the Palestinian cause. Could they be kind of a deciding factor in all of this? Could they really put the brakes on this if they wanted to?
That's a really key question.
Yeah.
And one that I think our sources offer some pretty interesting insights into. While it's true that Arab nations have, consistently been critical of Israel's policies towards the Palestinians,
All right.
their response so far to this specific proposal has been, kind of surprisingly muted.
Well, the 1973 oil embargo comes to mind.
Right.
Could you just remind us what the lasting impact of that was and, how might that inform the Arab nations' decision-making now?
Yeah, that's a great comparison, actually. I mean, the 1973 oil embargo, which was orchestrated by OPEC, that really sent shockwaves through the global economy, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it demonstrated very clearly the power that Arab nations could wield when they acted collectively.
Right.
The embargo led to soaring oil prices, fuel shortages, economic recession in many Western countries. And it also fundamentally shifted the geopolitical landscape, right?
Yeah.
It highlighted just how dependent, industrialized nations were on Arab oil.
Right. So there is a precedent
Yeah.
for Arab nations using their economic leverage to exert pressure on the global stage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
However, the situation today, it's far more complicated than it was back then.
Right.
The Arab world itself, it's not this monolithic block, right?
Right.
There are really deep divisions, both political and economic, among these nations. And, some countries, for example, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they've actually forged closer ties with Israel in recent years, driven by, shared security concerns, but also, common economic interests.
Okay, so getting them all on the same page in terms of, opposing this Gaza relocation, that could be a challenge.
It would be, yeah. It
Yeah.
definitely would. And even if they did manage to present kind of this united front,
Yeah.
the effectiveness of their response would really depend on what specific actions they actually took, right?
So what kind of actions could they realistically take? Like what's on the table?
Well, one possibility would be to convene some kind of like a high-level summit,
Right.
bringing together leaders from across the Arab world to kind of issue this joint declaration, condemning the relocation plan, outlining all the, the potential consequences for regional stability.
Right.
And that would send a really strong signal, right, to the international community that the Arab world stands united in its opposition.
That would definitely make a statement, I think.
Yeah.
But could they go further?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they could explore a whole range of economic measures, right? Things like reducing diplomatic ties, limiting trade, maybe even, threatening to restrict oil production.
Wow.
But, the impact of these kind of actions, it would really depend on, how much coordination there was and the willingness of key players like Saudi Arabia to actually participate.
I mean, could they really risk another oil embargo, though? I mean, wouldn't that hurt their own economies, too?
Yeah, it's definitely, it's a very delicate balancing act, right?
Yeah.
They'd have to weigh those potential economic costs against the political gains, And of course, any move like that would likely provoke, a very strong reaction from the U.S. and its allies.
It sounds like a really, really high-stakes gamble.
It would be.
Yeah. Are there any other options kind of on the table that wouldn't involve such, drastic measures?
Yeah, I mean they could also try to leverage their influence within, international organizations like the United Nations to,
Right.
to condemn the plan, call for international sanctions against Israel. They could also work to really mobilize public opinion globally, right?
Okay.
Highlighting the humanitarian and the legal implications of forcibly relocating millions of Palestinians.
So kind of a multi-pronged approach,
Hmm.
combining like, diplomacy,
Right.
economic pressure, and public advocacy.
Exactly, yeah. The key would be to present this really credible threat, right?
Yeah.
One that the US takes seriously.
Yeah.
But it's a complex and an uncertain landscape, and frankly it's unclear whether even a really coordinated and forceful response from the Arab world would be enough to derail a plan that Trump, seems pretty determined to pursue.
It's kind of disheartening to think that even with all that effort,
Yeah.
the outcome is still so uncertain.
It's definitely a challenging situation, there's no doubt. But
Yeah.
but I think it's important to remember that even if they can't completely, change US policy, a strong and coordinated response from the Arab world, it could send a really powerful message of solidarity with the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And it would keep this issue firmly on the international agenda.
Right. So it's about more than just the immediate outcome.
Yeah.
It's about sending a message,
Yes.
keeping the pressure on.
Precisely. And it's about reminding the world that the Palestinians are not alone in this struggle.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
from the potential for regional instability to the economic ramifications, the complex role of the Arab world. But there's one question that kind of keeps nagging at me,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure it's on our listeners' mind too. With all this talk of potential downsides and risks and instability and everything that could go wrong, I can't help but wonder,
Yeah.
could this relocation proposal, despite all those potential downsides, could it actually be a catalyst for positive change in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
That's a really provocative question,
Yeah.
and it's one that, some analysts are actually beginning to explore.
Yeah.
At first glance, I think it seems pretty counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how could a plan that risks inflaming tensions, upending the lives of millions of people, how could that possibly lead to a more peaceful resolution?
It seems like the opposite of what we'd want,
Yeah.
what we'd hope for.
Right.
But I have seen this idea kind of popping up
Mhm.
in some of the sources that you've given me. This notion that, maybe, just maybe, this very radical proposition could shake things up enough to actually break this decades-long stalemate.
Yeah, I mean, here's how that line of thinking goes. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been mired in this impasse for so long, right? I mean, negotiations have completely stalled, and both sides seem deeply, deeply entrenched in their positions,
Yeah.
with very little appetite for any kind of compromise.
It's like they've been stuck in this endless tug of war,
Yeah,
and neither side is willing to let go of the rope.
that's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And so the argument is that a radical proposal like this, as outlandish as it may seem,
Yeah.
it could force kind of this fundamental reassessment of the situation.
Okay, it could really jolt the international community out of its complacency and compel them to finally confront the urgency of finding some kind of lasting solution.
So it's like a shock to the system.
Yeah.
Forcing everyone to reevaluate their assumptions, consider new possibilities.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And it might even push both the Israelis and the Palestinians, to re-examine their own red lines and consider these concessions that they previously, would have considered completely unthinkable.
Right.
So the logic is that sometimes it takes this dramatic disruption to kind of break free from these really deeply ingrained patterns of conflict.
It's a compelling argument,
Yeah.
but it's also a really risky one.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't there a danger that this kind of disruption could backfire and lead to even more violence and instability?
Oh, absolutely. There's definitely that risk.
Yeah.
And any responsible analysis of this proposal needs to acknowledge that, right? However, if we look back at history, I think we can see that some of the most significant breakthroughs in peacemaking, they've actually come in the aftermath of these periods of really intense crisis.
So maybe that's saying it's always darkest before the dawn. maybe that applies here.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's impossible to predict the future with any certainty, obviously.
Yeah.
But, it's conceivable that this really chaotic situation, as unsettling as it is right now, it could ultimately pave the way for a more just and lasting peace, and it could force all parties involved to really confront the true costs of continued conflict and maybe create the space for some really bold and innovative solutions to emerge.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
Yeah, we have.
From trying to decipher Trump's motivations to examining the potential for regional upheaval, economic fallout, this complex role of the Arab world. And we've even, dared to consider the possibility of a silver lining in all of this.
Right. And it's important to reiterate, I think, that the situation is incredibly fluid.
Yeah.
There are so many variables at play here, and the ultimate outcome really does remain uncertain, you know.
Yeah.
What's crucial, I think, is that we stay informed, we critically evaluate the information that we're receiving,
right,
and be prepared for the unexpected.
For our listener, for the person who's listening to this right now, what would you say, they should take away from this deep dive into this potential relocation of the Gaza Strip? Because it's clearly not a simple issue. There's a lot of perspectives to consider.
I think one of the most important takeaways is that, even these seemingly outlandish ideas, they can have very real-world consequences. This proposal, regardless of whether it actually, comes to fruition or not, it's already sparked a lot of debate, raised anxieties, and forced a reassessment, I think, of these long-held assumptions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And as this situation continues to unfold, I think it's also really crucial for our listener to pay close attention to the role of the media. How is this story being framed?
Right.
Which voices are being amplified and which ones are being marginalized?
Yeah.
Whose interests are being served by the narratives that are being presented?
Those are excellent questions.
Yeah.
And I think, the way that the story is told, it's going to have a profound impact on how it's understood and ultimately, on the course of events.
Right.
So I think it's crucial to be really discerning consumers of information, to question those assumptions, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to really form our own informed opinions.
So as we conclude this deep dive, we leave you with this final thought. Don't just passively absorb the information that you're being given. Engage with it critically. Challenge the narratives.
Yeah.
Seek out the missing pieces of the puzzle.
Right.
Because ultimately, it's up to each of us to stay informed, to hold our leaders accountable, and to really advocate for a more just and peaceful world.
Well said. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.